The official start of spring is about a month away, and the Dollar Tree has already started putting out things for spring and Easter. So I put together a mega video of some of my favorite projects from the past to get inspiration for a new crafting season. I've made 2 of these crisscross ribbon wreaths on my channel before, and I wanted to make one for spring too. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 of the circular wreath forms. Any color will work, but I was lucky enough to find the gold beige color, which I think is really pretty. I'm also going to be using some ribbon. I have this green gingham ribbon on hand that I want to use up. I have 2 partial rolls and 1 full roll. And then I'll be using a bunch of different embellishments to decorate my wreath. I have some bunny picks, some burlap carrots, and some floral picks. I needed to attach both of my wreath forms together, so I laid one on top of the other, and I made sure that they were facing in opposite directions so that each side rounded out. Then I made sure that all of the crossbars on the wreath lined up, and I'm just going to use zip ties to attach mine together. So I went to where one of those crossbar sections is, and I just loaded my zip tie from the back to the front and tightened it down. I'll zoom in here so you can see it a little bit better. So you can see I'm just taking the zip tie from the back to the front, and I went the whole way around the wreath form, making sure that I got a zip tie at each intersection. After all of the excess was cut off of my zip ties, I went back through and I just turned the zip tie connector so that it was facing towards the back so you wouldn't see it through the ribbon. Starting on the back side with some hot glue, I added a drop to one of those zip ties and I laid my ribbon over it. Then I took my ribbon and I started wrapping it across the 2 wreath forms going on a diagonal. Now, like I said, I had 2 partial rolls of this ribbon and 1 full roll, but I wasn't sure that it was going to be enough for me to cover the entire wreath form with ribbon. So what I chose to do is cover it until there were only 2 sections of the wreath remaining, and then I went back on itself and covered it the other way. If you have enough ribbon, you could cover the entire wreath form, but because I really wasn't sure if I was going to have enough, I decided to leave 2 sections open because I knew I could cover it up with decorations later. So once I had my ribbon going in one direction on an angle, then I went back through and I started wrapping it in the opposite direction so that it would cross back over on itself. Now, the great thing about this is you don't have to use a lot of hot glue as you're wrapping. I always just added a little drop everywhere that there was a zip tie just to make sure that my ribbon wouldn't slide around too much. And I made sure that I always had the glue on the back side so that you wouldn't see it through the front of the ribbon. I wanted to create a double bow for the center of my wreath, so I'm taking some wider burlap ribbon. I cut one piece down to the width that I would like after I folded it into thirds, and then I took a second piece and I folded it into thirds again, and I made sure that it was just slightly narrower than the first piece, and then I cut another piece for the tails. Then I stacked all 3 of my pieces of ribbon on top of each other. I cinched them in the middle and tied them with some jute cord. And this gave me a really cute double bow for on my wreath. I wanted to make sure you wouldn't see the wreath form through any of my embellishments, so I did take another piece of that burlap ribbon and I just wound it around there so that it would blend in with everything that I was going to put on top of it. Now came the fun part. I just gathered up a bunch of florals and leaves that I had in my stash. I had some glittery Easter eggs that I've been holding on to for a while. I started with a base of some ferns because this is one of my favorite types of greenery for the spring. And then once I had that laid down, I just started building up a few other pieces of greenery and some eggs. And then of course I placed my bow in the center, and I did use one of those little bunny picks for on the center of my bow. This is a really fun wreath. It comes together pretty quickly because the base of it is just wrapping ribbons around the 2 wreath forms. And then you can get creative with how you want to decorate yours. You could add a ton of flowers. You could decorate it the whole way around. And I always like to add my decorations to the bottom of the wreath, but because there's not really a set direction on this wreath, you could add your focal point to the side or even the top. Just play around, have a good time, and this is a really great spring wreath. You could could pay over $100 for this set of 3 plant hangers, but with a few things from the Dollar Tree, you can make it for a lot less. I grabbed one of these oval tins that you can find at the Dollar Tree. They usually have these year-round, but they especially have them now that it's garden time. I grabbed 2 of the peel and stick tiles, and you can see the pattern on these is almost exactly like the Kirkland's ones. And I also grabbed one of the plant hangers that you can find out now. I have this tool in my craft stash. It's by We Are Memory Keepers. It's called a Dile, and it's a great way to poke holes through things that are a little bit thicker, like tin or chipboard or things like that. You can see it makes a really nice hole there. So I needed to poke 2 holes on one side and 1 hole on the other, since this plant hanger does have 3 chains coming down from it. If you don't have this tool, you could use a hammer and nail and just hammer through, just so that the hole's big enough to fit the hook from the plant hanger through. I wanted to get a better idea of the shape of this tin, so I grabbed my roll of craft paper and I just laid it over the tin and pressed down on it so that it would give me an idea of what kind of shape I needed to cut out of the peel and stick tile. If I would have just laid the tile right over top of it, it would have buckled slightly. So I needed to get the correct curve in order for the tile to fit on it more properly. I'm using a pencil here to sketch out the 2 lines that I created just so that you can see it a little better. And then I just cut that shape out with my scissors so that I could transfer it onto the peel and stick tile. I kept the adhesive backing on the back side of the tile because I didn't want my paper to stick to it. And I'm tracing from the back side. You can see I moved the line up a little bit. The first time I traced it, it was in the wrong spot, so I had to move it up. This tile is really easy to cut through. It's a very thin plastic. It's 2 layers, so I was able to cut through it with no problem with just my regular scissors. And at first I thought I was going to need 2 tiles for this tin because I didn't think that I would be able to get 2 strips of the same size out of 1 tile. But it turns out that there was enough space on 1 tile that I was able to take this same first piece that I used and just trace it again on the same tile so that I could have 2 pieces, one for the front side and one for the back side. And you can see the tile is 2 pieces and it's only connected on the edges. So I did lay just a little bit of hot glue down through the center so that the 2 pieces were connected and they wouldn't flop around. It can be a little tricky getting things to attach to metal like this, so I started with some E6000 glue and I just added a bit on the front side of my tin. I used a craft stick to smooth it out so there weren't any large clumps or bubbles, and then I peeled the backing off of the peel and stick tile and laid it over top. I also went through with some hot glue on the very edges of the tile just to make sure that everything was really held in place. So essentially we have 3 different types of adhesive on here, so I don't think this tile is going to go anywhere. Now you can see once I had the tile laid over the tin, there was some excess, and because this tile is so easy to cut, I just went through with my scissors and cut off any of the overhang. Once I had the tile pieces on both the front and back side of the tin, I went back through with my Crocodile tool again, and because I could see where I had already punched those holes, I could line it up and punch it again. Unfortunately, this tile was not long enough to go the whole way around the tin, and I didn't really care for how it looked on the sides where the 2 tiles didn't quite overlap. So to remedy that, I decided to cover it up with something else. I cut off some of the excess tile first because it was a bit bulky on the sides, and then I used some hot glue just to glue down both pieces of the tile to make sure that it was nice and flat. Before moving on to the sides, I wanted to give my planter that age distress look, so I'm using some white chalk paint and a chippy brush, and I'm doing a pretty heavy coat. I wanted a lot of the white to show through and to really show off the pattern on this tile. I found some burlap ribbon in my stash that had some pretty lace running through it, and it was the perfect width to cover up that spot where those tiles didn't meet. So I did a bit of hot glue to the bottom of the planter, and then I held the ribbon in place with the glue and some clear tape. I ran some glue up the sides, and you can see it's the perfect width to cover up both of those raw edges from the tile. Then I just needed to add some hot glue towards the inside of the planter, tuck my ribbon into it, and keep it secure with another piece of clear tape. tape. I think the planter looks good as is, but since I added the burlap ribbon to the sides, I wanted to pull some of that color through the front of the planter also. I have this really thin jute rope that I got from Amazon, and I just did a small bead of hot glue around the bottom of the planter and laid the rope into it, and then I repeated that on the top. This not only pulled that color from the burlap through the planter, but it also helped cover up any of the raw edges from where I had cut the tile. Before adding any flowers to my planter, I wanted to attach this plant hanger. It was really easy with the clips provided. And if you didn't want to use this as a hanging planter, you could use it as a standalone centerpiece also. This pack of felt bunny garland at the Dollar Tree is such a good deal. You get 8 felt bunnies for $1.25. I grabbed 2 packs because I wanted to make some bunny pockets. So you can see here, there's a lot of different colors in this garland. There's some really bright colors and there's some pastel colors. I tend to go with more pastel colors, so that's what I'm going to use today, but feel free to switch it up however you like. The first thing I had to do was take all of the bunnies off of the ribbon that they came on, which was easy. They weren't glued down or anything. I just had to slide them off. After I had both garlands taken apart, I grabbed 2 bunnies of the same color. I'm using the purple one here, and I started by taking the pom-pom tail off of one of the bunnies. Then I laid it over top of the other bunny just to make sure that it matched up evenly, which it did, and I found a spot on the bunny where I wanted to cut it straight across. I'm using pinking shears here, but you really don't have to because felt doesn't fray. I just thought it gave it a nice touch. You could either hot glue or sew this pocket onto your bunny. I don't have a sewing machine, so I'm just using my fine tip hot glue gun here. And surprisingly enough, this felt was thick enough that you didn't see the hot glue through it, so that made me really happy. I started at the bottom. I added just a very fine bead of hot glue around the feet of the bunny, and then once I had that lined up and glued down, then I went up on each side using my fine tip glue gun to secure the pocket into place. You have a lot of different options when it comes to decorating these bunny pockets. I wanted to keep mine fairly simple. I started by taking 2 lengths of jute cord and just creating a simple bow. And then I hot glued that at the top of my bunny to cover up those little holes that were there from where it was strung onto the ribbon. After I created a few of the pockets, I realized I had all these bunny heads laying around that I didn't know what to do with. So I took one of the bunny heads and I folded it in half, and I just cut a simple heart shape out of it to act as a second embellishment for my pockets. Once I had all of my hearts cut out, I took my glue gun and I just ran a bead of hot glue right down the center of the heart and placed it on the pocket part of my bunny. This way the heart would flap open a little bit and give the pocket itself just a little bit more dimension. And I switched up the colors so that each bunny had a different color heart on its belly. Now I think these pockets are super cute and you can do a lot with them. You can either put some Easter treats in them, or I had another idea where I thought it would be really cute to use these as silverware holders for your Easter dinner. You can fit a fork, a knife, and a spoon in there, and I think that would look really cute at each place setting. I had a few of those bunnies left over, so I thought I'd make a cute Easter sign with those. In addition to those, I am going to use an 11 by 14 stretched canvas. I don't think I got this from the Dollar Tree. I just had it in my stash. And then I also had a few wooden letters. I had enough to spell out the word Easter, so I'm going to use those also. I started by removing all of the staples from the back of the frame. I got this handy staple remover from Home Depot. You've probably seen me struggle to get these staples out in the past. This thing works pretty well. I had to buy this actually because we decided to rip the carpet out of our bedroom and just have the hardwood in there. And so that came in really handy while we were working on the carpet. And since I had it for that, I thought, why not use it to get the staples out of this frame? I do want to use this canvas canvas material for my sign, so I'm using a pair of scissors, and you can see the crease lines where it was wrapped around the wooden part of the frame. So I'm just cutting towards the inside of the innermost crease. That way I know it'll fit inside the frame with no problem. Just make sure that when you're cutting, you cut towards the inside, like I said, so that you don't have any material hanging over the edges. My original plan was to stain these letters and the frame both with the Antique Wax by Waverly, but once I started applying it to these letters, I really didn't like how it looked. The letters, I don't know, maybe there was too much grain in the wood. It's kind of a cheap wood. I think this pack of letters was from the Dollar Tree. I felt like the wax wasn't taking very well, and there was just so much variation in color that I just didn't care for it. So I put that on hold, and I moved to the frame, where I used a baby wipe to apply my antique wax. Then I went back to those letters again, and I decided just to give them a quick coat of black chalk paint instead. I wanted you to see that process just because I know sometimes, we get frustrated as crafters when things aren't quite turning out how we think they should. So sometimes it's better just to put it to the side, work on something else, and then come back to it, and you'll find a solution for the problem that you had. While my frame and my letters were drying, I picked 3 of the bunnies out and I just laid them side by side. I kind of overlapped their little feet, and I used just a bit of hot glue to connect the 3 of them together. This felt is actually pretty thick, so I didn't see the hot glue through the feet of the bunny. And then there are holes at the top of this because this was meant to be a garland, so I just tied a simple jute bow for each one and hot glued that to the top. Next, I moved on, and I have my piece of canvas material laid onto the back side of my frame. Now, there's 2 sides to the canvas material. There's the white side that you would normally paint on, and then there's the linen side that's on the back. I like the look of the linen side, so I made sure that when I was gluing this down, the linen side would show through the front of the frame. And you can see here my 3 little bunnies fit perfectly inside that frame. So I just went through and I just placed a few dots of hot glue. Like I said, you really couldn't see the glue through the felt, but I didn't want to take a chance that you might, so I just put glue where I knew you wouldn't be able to see it. Then I laid my letters that spelled Easter down through the center, and I just centered it up with the 3 bunnies, and I really like how the black pops on this. So like I said, even though it didn't turn out how I originally thought it would, I really like how it turned out in the end. This embossed metal pocket really caught my eye, but I did not care for the $34.99 price tag. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed one of their sticky tiles that looks almost exactly like the pattern on the Kirkland's one, and I'm also going to be using 2 signs. These are from fall. They're just plain squares, but I like to use these kinds of sign because they're really easy to cut down, so anything you have on hand will work. Since this was just a square tile and I had a square sign, I thought it would be easier just to cut the sign after I put the tile on it. So you can see here, I just lined it up in one corner of the sign and pressed it down really well so that it would stick to my sign. Then I grabbed my utility knife and a ruler, and I just started making passes down the side of the tile. Now, I'll tell you, this utility knife is nothing fancy. This is actually from the Dollar Tree, so it's probably not the sharpest, but you can see it still works for cutting down these signs. I just made a few passes. I wasn't pressing too hard, and then I was able to just bend the sign back and forth until it broke off. And don't worry if you have a few rough edges, because you can take care of those later. So on the second side of my tile, you can see I'm just doing the same thing. I'm making a few light passes down the side, and you can see there's a few rough edges on this side, so I just went back through with that same cheap utility knife and I just cut off any of the excess. This piece is going to be on the front of my pocket, but I also needed a piece for the back. So on the second sign, I took this first piece that I already cut down and I lined it up in the corner again, just like I did with the sticky tile on the first one. This time I traced it out with a pencil, and then I repeated the same process. I just took my utility knife and made a few light passes until I had made a groove, and then I was able to break the sign where I needed it. Since the tile I'm using is a square, I was able to take that piece that I cut off of the top that was the same width as my tile, and that's what I'm going to use to create my sides. So this piece ended up being about 3 inches wide, so I decided to cut it right in half down to 1.5 inches. I thought that would be a nice deep pocket for what I needed. So you can see here, I just measured over 1.5 inches, and then doing the same thing again, I'm using my utility knife to cut this piece in half. And then since I used 2 signs, I had another piece that was the same length as this one. So again, I just measured over 1.5 inches and cut it down the middle. Now that all of my pieces are cut down, I did go through with the sanding block and just made sure that all of the edges were smoothed out. I was able to get all of the excess off just using my utility knife, but I did want to make sure that the edges were smooth since I was going to be assembling this into a box. I was really careful with the piece that had the tile on it, and I made sure that I was always sanding away from the tile so that I didn't cause any damage to the surface. As I was assembling my box, I had to keep reminding myself that the printed part needed to go towards the inside. So you can see I have my backside piece with the print up, and after I added a bead of hot glue to the one edge, I took one of my 1.5 inch wide pieces and just lined it up with that same thing, but I made sure that the print side was towards the center so that you wouldn't see it from the outside. Then I just needed to add my 2 sides. So again, I just ran a small bead of hot glue here, and then I lined it up with the first piece that I had laid down and also with the back side. And I'm using a silicone mat here because some of that glue did end up oozing out from towards the back side of the box. I wasn't too worried about that. I knew you wouldn't be able to see it, but I wanted to keep this as clean as possible. And the silicone mat really comes in handy for any time that you have some glue oozing over the edges. After I had all 3 of my 1.5 inch wide pieces on, I just did a dry fit to make sure that my tile would fit over the top. And then I went back through to reinforce the box with hot glue again. So on all of the inside seams of the box, since you're not going to be able to see that, I took a pretty good amount of hot glue and I made sure to cover all of the seams, and I also made sure to go up the sides of the corners as well where those 2.5 inch pieces met, just to add a little more security to my box. It might be a little hard to see on the camera, but where that glue had oozed through the seams, I wanted to clean it up a bit before I painted it, so I just took my sanding block and ran it around the edges to make sure that it was mostly smoothed out. This is the back side of the box, so you're probably not going to see it anyway, but I just like to make sure that it was a little bit smooth. Next, I'm using some gray chalk paint, and I'm giving everything on the outside of the box one good coat with the paint. And then on the inside, I just dropped down about 3 inches and put a little paint there in case you would see that print through the top. I did go out of frame here, but on the piece that I had stuck the tile onto, you could see that wood around the edges, and when I glued this down, I knew you would be able to see that wood. So I just very carefully took the very tip of my brush and put a little gray chalk paint where the wood would show, just so you wouldn't see that after I assembled my box. This is where having a fine tip glue gun really comes in handy. I was able to lay just a really small bead of glue on the front side of my box so that I could lay my tile piece on top of it. There was a little bit of glue that oozed out, but I was able to wipe it away right away so you couldn't see it. You could stop here with your box, but I really like that aged distress look. So I took some white chalk paint and I dipped my brush in it, but I took almost all of the excess paint off so that I could just dry brush some white paint over the surface. I concentrated most of the paint on the edges, but I did go through the surface of the backside and across the front of the tile too, just to lay down a little bit of that paint. I think it gave it more of that galvanized look, and it also made it look a little bit aged and weathered. You'll see here at the end when I compare my box to the Kirkland's that the Kirkland's also had hooks coming out of the bottom. I chose not to do that because I really didn't have a need for that. But if that's something that you want to do, you could buy one of those over the door hangers from the Dollar Tree. Just cut off the over the door part and attach that to the back side of your box. The Kirkland's box had a metal hanger, but I'm using macrame cord for mine because that's what I have on hand. I took some hot glue and I just laid it on the inside back corner of my box, and I laid my rope into it, and then I just repeated that on the other side, making sure that I had enough glue to kind of wrap up around the rope a bit to make it more secure. I love succulents, and I love how big this succulent holder from Kirkland's is. It measures about 12 by 12. For this project, I just needed 2 packs of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree, and these were the bigger boxes, the one that has 72 in it. I needed to create the 4 walls for my planner to start, so I'm using a T-square here and my big silicone mat just to help prevent any hot glue from getting on my surface. I started by lining up 6 of the tumbling tower blocks and just gluing them in a straight line. Now I wanted to bricklay my tumbling tower blocks because I am going to make each wall of my planter about 4 rows high. So there's a couple different ways you could cut these tumbling tower blocks. I have these miter shears that I get from Amazon, and they will cut through them, but it does take a good bit of hand strength to get the blocks cut. If you don't think you could use something like that, you could use just a regular handsaw and a miter box to cut these blocks in half. Or if you wanted to avoid cutting these at all, you could just create 4 rows of 6 blocks and not bricklay them. They could just line up on top of each other. I think either way it would look good. I just really wanted to try out the bricklay pattern, and I wanted to see if I could really cut through these blocks with my miter shears. So for the second row on this wall, you can see I laid one of my half blocks down, and then I laid 5 full blocks down and my other half block on the other end. That way when I stack the 2 rows together, it'll bricklay the Jenga blocks from each other. And like I said, I need 4 rows for each wall of my planter. So that means I need about 24 blocks for each side. So you'll need 96 blocks altogether. That's why I had 2 packs of the tumbling tower blocks there. And I got my 3rd row done here. Now I'm just using hot glue on these. You could use wood glue if you wanted to, but I always have pretty good luck with the Gorilla Glue sticks. They seem to hold wood pretty well. I've not really had anything fall apart on mine when I'm just using the glue sticks on the wood. So again, on the 4th row for the wall of my block, I'm just cutting one of the Jenga blocks in half. Now these Jenga blocks are just slightly smaller than 2 inches, so I cut my blocks down to about 1 inch in size. And again, I did the same thing with the 4th row. I started with one of the half blocks. I glued down 5 of the full blocks, and then I put another half block on the opposite end. After I had all 4 rows of my tumbling tower blocks assembled, then I could go through with my hot glue and glue the 4 rows together. I started with one of the rows that had the 6 whole blocks in it, and then on top of that I laid one of the rows that had the half blocks. And then I repeated that again for rows 3 and 4. Now like I said, I chose to make my box 4 rows high, but it's up to you how high you want to make yours. You could make this higher or shorter. Either way it would look good. Also, try not to stress about the rows being a little uneven or there being some gaps in between some of the blocks. I just think that adds to the uniqueness of a handmade planter. Once I had all 4 walls of my box assembled, I wanted to give it a little more stability. So on the back side of each of my walls, I'm just taking some craft sticks and I ran them on a diagonal just to hold most of the blocks together. I'm using my T-square again here to help line up the walls of my box. I'm using the same Gorilla Glue hot glue sticks to put everything together, and you can see I lined the first 2 up first, and the key that I found to make sure that this was nice and sturdy is to really hold those 2 pieces in place while the glue sets. If you move on too fast, that glue is going to be warm and you run the risk of having the 2 pieces come apart. So once that was set in place, then I just moved it over to the other side, and using some hot glue again, I just glued on the 3rd wall, and then I repeated that again for the 4th wall. Once all four sides of my box were put together, I wanted to reinforce those corners a bit more. So on the inside of the box where the two pieces met, I added a generous amount of hot glue just to give it more stability and make sure that my box was nice and sturdy. I did that in all four corners of my box. If you wanted to take the time to create a bottom for your box out of some more of the tumbling tower blocks, you could do that. But I wanted to make mine a bit simple, so I'm just using a piece of heavyweight chipboard and I cut it down to fit my box. I used a little bit of hot glue just to glue it onto the bottom. And once again, for added stability, I went through and added a good amount of hot glue where the chipboard and the bottom of the box met. Before going through and adding my succulents to my box, I took some white chalk paint and I gave a pretty heavy coat. I let a little bit of the wood show through, but I mostly wanted it to be white. And I really like once I added the paint that you could really see the seams in between each of the blocks. I think it just gave this box a nice character. Now, because this box is so big, it measures about 12 inches by 12 inches, I had to use a lot of floral foam in it. And then I also covered up that foam with some moss. You can see most of the floral foam that I had were scrap pieces that I had laying around, which actually worked out perfect to get those out of my stash. But when I show you the finished picture, you'll see that I did add a pretty good amount onto my finished piece. I think I did an extra $20 just because if you didn't have floral foam laying around and if you didn't have a lot of succulents in your craft stash, that would cost a good bit of money to get this box filled because it is so big. But even though I did have to spend that extra cost getting the floral foam and the succulents in there, it's still a lot cheaper than if I would have bought the Kirkland's version. I'm really inspired to add more greenery and florals to my home decor, and these planters are a perfect way to do that. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 packs of these bamboo rings. There's 2 different sizes in here. I'm only going to use the smaller one today, but with both packs, you could make 2 different size planters. I'm also using a pack of the craft sticks from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to use a few wooden beads that I already have on hand to act as feet. I wanted to create a base for my bottom ring first. I could have used cardboard here or chipboard or anything just to be able to set a plant on, but I thought since I had this whole pack of craft sticks, I may as well use them up. And the craft sticks were a perfect fit. They fit exactly across the center of these smaller rings. So I just started gluing around the edges of the ring. I started laying my craft sticks on. You can see the one in the middle there. It fit just perfectly from end to end, and then as I worked my way down to one end, it started to overlap, and that was okay because after I had all of the craft sticks on, I went through with my utility knife and just started cutting off the excess. These craft sticks are pretty thin that you get from the Dollar Tree, so it was pretty easy to cut through these, and I always find that it's easier to make a few light passes rather than trying to cut through the whole stick at once. So I'm just taking my utility knife here and I'm making a few passes just to get the excess off. And remember, this is the bottom of the planter. You're not actually going to be able to see it. I just thought this was a neat way to use up some craft sticks rather than cutting a piece of cardboard. After all the excess was cut off, I did go through with a sanding block and just remove any sharp edges just to make sure that I didn't get any splinters. When I need to cut a bunch of craft sticks down to the same length, I always like to use my paper trimmer. So I'm using those same craft sticks from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting the rounded edge off of one side, and then I'm just measuring out 5 inches and cutting it again so that my planter will be 5 inches tall. Putting this plant holder together was really simple. I just started adding hot glue to the base piece that I had created on the outside of the ring, and I just lined my craft stick up. You can see I have my silicone mat here. This just helps protect my work surface, and it also helps make sure that I can line up the bottom of the craft stick with the bottom of the ring. Once I had a few rings in place, then I went through and I hot glued the other end to the second ring so that I could space these out a little bit more evenly. Once I had a few of the craft sticks hot glued onto one side of my plant holder, I jumped over to the other side because I noticed that it had started to droop, so this just made it a little bit easier to keep it even on both sides. So I'm doing the same thing on this second side here. I'm just adding hot glue to the bottom ring and the top ring, and I'm holding my craft stick in place there.
I kept my craft sticks fairly close together. That's the main difference between this one and the one on the Kirkland's website. The Kirkland's ones, the vertical pieces were a little bit farther apart, so it's up to you how you decide to do yours. But I like the look of mine with the craft sticks a little bit closer together. Here's where you can decide what will fit your home's decor the best. For me, I really like the look of the natural wood, but I also like that distressed look. So I'm taking some white chalk paint here, and I'm just dry brushing over the surface, leaving some of that wood show through. You could buy fancier feet for your plant stand, but I'm all about using up what I already have. And since I already had these white wooden beads on hand, I just hot glued these to the bottom.
I have an electric fireplace in my living room, and I always like creating a garland to hang across the front of it. I saw these gingham bunnies in the Dollar Tree, and I thought they were so cute, and I really liked that they came in a wide variety of colors. I'm going to use the pink ones today, but you could mix up the colors however you'd like. I'm also going to use 2 sheets of white felt and some jute cord. I'm creating a banner style garland, so I needed to cut my felt down into more manageable pieces. I laid one of my bunnies down to get a good idea of how big of a piece I would need for each banner, and the measurement that I came up with was 4 inches by 7 inches. This worked out really well for me, so if you're going to use the same bunnies, I'll save you the hassle of figuring it out and just cut your pieces down to 4 by 7. I'm using 6 bunnies because that's how many came in a pack, and it worked out really perfectly because I was able to get 3 banners out of each piece of felt. To create the banner shape at the bottom of my piece of felt, I laid my ruler down, and since my piece was 4 inches wide, I placed a dot at the 2-inch mark. Now my ruler is 1.5 inches wide, so I'm cutting up 1.5 inches to that dot straight up the center, and then I'm going from each corner up to that dot also. As I got closer to the dot, I made sure that I cut that marker away so that you wouldn't be able to see it from the front. And then I just repeated that on all 6 pieces. So you can see here again, I'm cutting straight up the center to that dot, and then I'm just cutting from each corner up to that dot also, and that gives me a nice uniform banner on each piece. I realized that the back side of the bunnies look just as nice as the gingham side, so I wanted to switch these up a little bit to add a little bit of variation on my garland. It was easy enough to pull the bow off the front of the bunny on the gingham side, and then I just replaced it on the back side on the plain side, and you can see it kind of looks like one of those little Easter peep bunnies, and I did that on 3 of them. So then I had 3 of the gingham bunnies and then 3 of just the plain pink bunnies. It doesn't take much hot glue to get these bunnies attached to the garland pieces. I just ran a line of hot glue right down the backside center of each bunny, and I laid it in the center of my banner pieces. Next, I needed some holes to fit my jute cord through, so at the very top, I just folded the top down about 1/2 inch, and I took my scissors and I cut a very small slit on each side of my bunny. And you can see when I pull it apart, it's not very big at all, and because felt material doesn't fray, you're not going to see any rough edges from doing this. But it's a great way to be able to attach your banner pieces and have them be able to slide around, so that once I got it up on my fireplace, I was able to slide the pieces until they were evenly spread out across the front. Now it's up to you how you want to string your pieces onto your jute cord or ribbon or yarn or whatever you're choosing to use. I didn't want to see the jute cord from the front, so I'm going in through the top first, and then I'm winding the jute cord through the back side of the banner piece and then back up through the back side. If you did it the opposite way, the jute cord would be seen from the front, and I think that looks cute too. I just wanted mine to be on the back side. When I was browsing the internet for inspiration for Easter crafts, I kept seeing sock bunnies pop up on my Pinterest page. So I went to the Dollar Tree and I grabbed a pair of their fuzzy Snuggadoo socks, and I also got a bag of rice. I wasn't able to find a solid pair of socks at my Dollar Tree. I could only find these ones that had the white accents, but I figured I could make them work anyway. Now, if you have a solid color pair of socks, you don't have to do this step, but I wanted to take some of that excess white off of the toe portion of my sock. So I tied a piece of jute cord around the bottom of the white part, and then I turned it inside out so that you wouldn't see any of that white from the bottom of the bunny. Then I put the whole sock inside of a mason jar because it just made it a lot easier to get the rice in there. And I started pouring in the rice. Now it seems like it fills up really fast, but you have to kind of pat it down and really work that rice in there because you want to make sure you have a good amount of rice in there so that your bunny will hold its shape. So I kept pouring and then tapping it down and pushing it down with my hands to make sure that I had the sock as full as I could get it. Then I pulled it out of the mason jar and I worked all of the rice down towards the bottom of the sock, and I left about 4 inches at the top, and that's where I tied on my second piece of jute cord. Now, like I said before, I needed to get that white part off of the toe portion of my bunny, but if you're just using a plain color pair of socks, you don't have to do that. You can just fill your sock up without doing anything to the toe. Once I had that second piece of jute cord in place, then I went down where I thought I had enough room for the head, and I tied another piece of jute cord. So you can already see the body of our bunny is coming together pretty quickly, and because I do have a white heel on the sock, it left me a white spot on the bunny, which I didn't really mind, and you actually could use that for the face of the bunny if you wanted to. I cut off the white that was at the top of my bunny, at the top of the sock, and then I started working on the ears. I cut right down through the center of the front and back of the sock, and then I just started cutting the ear shape in. So you can see I'm kind of rounding it with my scissors until I had some nice rounded ears for my bunny. For my first bunny, I wanted to create a simple bow tie, so I took a piece of burlap ribbon, I added a small bead of hot glue to one end, and then I looped it over and I cinched it in the center. And while that glue was still just a bit warm and I had accordion pleated the middle, I took a craft clip and I just held it in place with a craft clip because I wasn't ready to tie the center yet. Then I took another small piece of that same burlap ribbon and I folded it into thirds so that I could take it to my bow tie then and glue it around the center where you would normally tie it with some jute cord. And that gave it a nice finished look and gave it more of a bow tie look rather than a craft bow. Then I added my bow tie to my first bunny with just a little bit of hot glue. Now I decided not to add any faces to my bunnies, but you could do that if you'd like. For my second bunny, instead of adding a bow, I added some greenery and a little sparkly foam ball at the top of my bunny. And then as a finishing touch, I did have a few pom-poms laying around. So on the back side of my bunny, I just added a pom-pom as a little tail. I really like the look of this wood bead lantern on the Kirkland's website, and even though it's on sale right now for $11.99, originally it was selling for $19.99. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 of the stretch canvases that measure 6 inches by 8 inches. I'm also going to use a few of the regular size craft sticks and some white wooden beads that I already had in my stash. I started by prepping my canvases. I don't need the canvas material for this project, but I always like to hang on to it in case I need it later on. I'm just using a stapler remover here to remove the staples off the back side. If you didn't want to mess around with taking out the staples, you could just cut the canvas away. The staples would be towards the inside of the lantern anyway, so they wouldn't show up too much. Then I got to work on cutting down my craft sticks. I always like to use my paper trimmer for this, and I always do have this linked in the description box below. I just think it's an easier way to make sure that all of your cuts are even, and I cut all of my sticks down to 5 inches. You may have seen my hand fly up on the screen there. That's how I leave myself notes sometimes when I'm recording as I craft so that I don't forget how
short I need to cut something down to or how many of something that I need. So next I moved on to the painting. I'm using some white chalk paint here, and I'm giving both of my frames and all 4 of my craft sticks a quick coat of the chalk paint. I'm not too worried if some of the wood shows through because I do like that distressed look, and the wooden beads that I'm using are already white, but they do have a distressing on them as well, so I figured that it would just go together if I left a little of that wood show through the paint. While those pieces are drying, I moved on to my wooden beads. I have a pair of these miter shears. I do have these linked in the description box also. They're really handy for cutting through things like beads or wooden dowels, or even the Jenga blocks from the Dollar Tree. I've cut through those already too. It just makes it a lot easier. And there is a little plate on it. If you need to cut an angle, you can switch it up to whatever angle you need. But for the beads, I just needed to cut those in half. So you can see I'm laying these beads right in the channel that's on the middle of the miter shears. And then I just close the bead or the blade down on top of it. And I'm cutting right through that hole rather than cutting the other way. Now, I know on Amazon you can find half round wood beads already cut like this, but since I had these white ones in my stash, I figured I'd use up what I had. And I also wanted to show too that after the front sides of my frames and my sticks dried, I did flip them over and give the other side a coat of paint too, since you would be able to see that a bit through the lantern. Now that everything's nice and dry, I could start assembling my lantern. I took one of my craft sticks and I applied just a small amount of hot glue to the bottom corner of the first frame. And then I took the other frame and I laid it down on the opposite side of the craft stick. So I'm just going to use 2 craft sticks on each side of the frames to hold them together because I wanted the sides to be nice and open so that you could see through it. So now that I have the bottom stick in place, I'm going to move to the top, and I just did the same thing. I applied some hot glue and I laid that craft stick right over the one frame, and then I added hot glue and glued it down to the other side. And then I repeated that on the opposite side of the frames as well. And it might be a little tricky to see here, but I did leave the sides of the frames that had the staples on it towards the center of the lantern. But like I said, if you didn't feel like messing around with taking out those staples, I think you could have left them in and just painted right over it, and you probably wouldn't even notice them. The Kirkland's lantern had beads going the whole way around the top and the bottom, but I really wasn't sure that I'd have enough beads to do that, so I decided just to stick with the parts that had the craft stick. So you can see here, I'm just adding a little bit of hot glue to the underside of my half bead, and I'm laying it down on top of that craft stick that goes around the bottom of my lantern. Then I moved to the top side of the lantern and I added the half beads to the top part, and once I had both sides done where the craft sticks were, I realized I didn't have enough beads, so I didn't put them on the actual frames. I only added it to the craft sticks. But if you have enough beads, you could go the whole way around and it would look just as good. Now, you might have also seen in the Kirkland's picture that it did have a handle, but I really liked how this looked just nice and open like this. So I decided not to add a handle to mine, but there's a lot of ways you could do that. You could use a piece of wire and run it from one side to the other going across the top, or you could even tie on some jute rope or some nautical rope and give it 2 handles on each side. Now, the last thing that I wanted to do for my lantern was add some feet, and I did have a few white wooden beads that were a bit larger. So I just used some hot glue in each corner and added a bead on to act as a foot. A few years ago, I did a whole video on making coasters with things you can get from the Dollar Tree. I still love making coasters, and when I saw these wooden egg ornaments, I knew they would make great coasters. I also grabbed a few gift bags that had fun Easter prints on them, and I'm going to be using one of the cork sheets that you can find in the Crafter's Square section. The wooden eggs are really thin, so in order to make them thicker and a little more sturdy, I just used some hot glue to glue 2 of them together. And don't worry about the holes at the top, we're going to be covering that up anyway.
Next, I got to work cutting off the bottom of my bag, and I cut up one side so that I could lay it flat. Now, because the pattern on this bag, the eggs are pretty large, I wanted to be mindful of where I was placing my eggs so that the egg pattern didn't look off center or anything like that on my egg. So I found a good spot where I could center one of the eggs inside of my egg, and then I just traced around my egg shape with a pencil. I did 2 of each pattern, so I traced 2 eggs onto one gift bag and 2 onto the other. I took my time cutting out my eggs from the gift bag, but don't worry if you don't get them perfect. We'll be able to clean up any rough edges later. I'm using some matte finish Mod Podge. I just applied a very, very thin coat to the front of the egg, and then I laid my piece of gift bag on top of it. I didn't apply Mod Podge over the front to start. I wanted to make sure that the underneath Mod Podge dried first. That way I could avoid any kind of wrinkling in the paper. Usually the wrinkling comes when you put the Mod Podge on top, so I wanted to get that thin base coat down first and let it dry really, really well before I moved on to applying the next coat. After I let that base coat dry really, really well, I took my sanding block and I went around all of the edges. This took out any imperfections anywhere that I had cut the paper just slightly too big. It took any of that excess off and finished off the edges nicely. Now that everything is nice and cleaned up, then I went back through and applied 2 more coats of Mod Podge over the top of my coasters to protect the surface from any spills, and it even helps protect the wood a little bit from the heat of any kind of mug that you're going to place on it. After my top coats of Mod Podge were nice and dry, I got to work creating a backer for my coasters. I'm using the cork sheet here, and I'm able to get all 4 eggs cut out of one sheet. I'm just using a pen here, and I'm tracing over the top of the cork sheet. And then I started cutting it out, but I made sure that I stayed about 1/8 of an inch inside that pen line so that it would fit on the back of the egg and nothing would stick out. Now these cork sheets are self-adhesive, so all I had to do then was peel the backing off and apply it to the back side of my egg. An alternative to using the cork sheets would be just to use a piece of felt. You can do the same thing. Trace your egg out onto your piece of felt, cut it out, and hot glue it to the back. I also wanted to show you that these treat bags from the Dollar Tree, these really cute bunny ones with the floppy ears, are the perfect size to store your coasters in. I was able to fit all 4 of mine in with no problem. So this is a great storage idea, or you could use this to give as a gift to someone else. The plus section of my Dollar Tree had this really cute bunny-shaped grapevine wreath form. It had chicken wire in through the belly and the head part. In addition to that, I'm also going to use this wooden letter that I got from Walmart. It's about 8 inches tall. I chose the letter M because that's what my last name starts with. And I'm also going to use a few bunches of greenery and flowers. There's a lot of different ways that you could decorate this monogram initial however you'd like, but for me, I wanted to keep it a little plain, so I just gave mine a quick coat of white chalk paint. Once that white paint was dry, then I went back in with the mineral color by Waverly, and I did a dry brushing around the edges to give it that distressed look. I wanted to make a flower crown for my bunny, but you also could decorate the bottom of the bunny's head and give it a nice big bow or a bow tie or something like that. For my flower crown, I grabbed one of these larger wooden craft sticks from Walmart, and I'm just laying it across the top of the head to get an idea of how wide of a space I could have. I cut my stick down, and that's what I'm going to build my flower crown onto. I always like to start out with a base of greenery first, so the 2 bouquets that I have to work with, I clipped all of the pieces off of them and separated them so that it would be a little bit easier for me to work with. So you can see I laid down the greenery first, and then I just got to work laying down some of the other smaller flowers, and then I filled in the gaps with some of the larger flowers. And while you're watching me do this, I do want to apologize if my voice gets a little hoarse. It's been really windy here in PA, and it's kicked something up outside that is just really messing with my allergies, so my voice keeps giving out. And if you didn't already know, I do work full-time outside of YouTube as a hairdresser, so I talk all day long, and I'm really sorry if I start to sound a little nasally or a little scratchy, but I really wanted to get this video out before Easter. Now that my flower crown is all put together, I needed a way to attach it to my wreath form. So I flipped it over on the back, and you can see I added a dollop of hot glue, and I laid a pipe cleaner going perpendicular to that craft stick. And then I just held it in place with a piece of clear tape until the glue had a chance to cool down. I also did that with this wooden M that I had. I took the pipe cleaners though, and I cut them in half. I didn't quite need that long of a length. And for the letter M, I just attached 4 pipe cleaners in each of the corners of the letter. And then of course I took my clear tape and went back through and made sure that that was held down nice and secure. The pipe cleaners on the back of the letter and the flower crown made it really easy to attach it to this wreath form. And since there was already chicken wire inside the wreath form, I was able to just slide the pipe cleaners through some of the holes of the chicken wire and twist them on the back side to hold everything in place. So this is a really great idea too if you like to change things up from year to year. Since the letter and the flower crown aren't permanently attached to the wreath form, you could switch it out for other things for the following year. And even though this is a bunny, I think I'm going to leave this up for the rest of spring into summer because I just think it turned out so cute. I seriously almost fell over when I saw that this bird-shaped welcome sign was $54.99 on the Kirkland's website. I got really lucky because there are some wooden cutout birds at the Dollar Tree right now, and these are really cute because the front side is a chalkboard, but on the back side it's just wood, and the little wing is cut out to give it more dimension. I'm also going to be using some wooden beads and some jute twine. I did cut out a decal on my Cricut that says welcome, but you could also use scrapbook stickers instead. I decided to change my sign up a little from the Kirkland sign. Rather than having 3 different colors of birds for my sign, I decided to make mine all the same color. So I'm using some of the Antique Wax by Waverly here, and I'm using a baby wipe, and I'm just giving each of the birds on the back side, not the chalkboard side, a quick coat of the Antique Wax. That's why I was so excited to see that on the back side of the chalkboard bird, there was just wood. So you could switch the sign up to fit your home's decor, and depending on what room you want to put this in, you could coordinate the colors to match that also. After my antique wax had a chance to dry, I just went through with some white chalk paint and I gave it a little bit of a dry brush around the outside of the bird just to add a little more texture and dimension. And again, this is a great way to play around and just customize it to fit your taste. And also too, if you didn't want a welcome sign, you could use as many birds as you want to either spell out your last name or even friends or family. I also think it would be cute to not have any words on these little birds at all. You could just paint each of them a fun, bright color and string them up and just have them be birds. They don't have to say welcome. I am choosing for my birds to say welcome. So like I mentioned before, I cut this decal out using my Cricut. If you have a Cricut too, I find it's easier sometimes when I'm creating a word like this. Rather than cutting each letter out individually, I just type it out as one word and then I just cut the letters apart myself. But also, if you don't have a Cricut, you could try hand lettering onto these birds, whatever you wanted to say. But because these aren't very tall, I think I made my letters about 1.5 inches tall. You could easily find stickers in the scrapbook section of, say, Michael's or Hobby Lobby that would fit on these birds, and you could just use those instead. I took a pretty long length of jute cord and I folded it in half. On the folded end, I just went down a few inches and tied a simple knot. In the Kirkland's hanger, there was a wood ring at the top. I thought I had some of those in my stash, but I couldn't find them, so I just decided to make a loop out of the jute cord and tie a knot. I added on 2 of my wood beads and I strung the other end of my jute cord through the front of my first bird, and then on the back side I laid down just a small bead of hot glue and put the jute cord into it. This would help making sure that my birds don't flip around too much on the jute cord, and then I just repeated that the whole way down.
And some of you are probably looking at my birds laid out here and see that I don't have the letters in the correct order. I didn't catch that right away, but I did catch that before I added on my next bird. I realized I was about to put an L on instead of an E. So the whole way down my sign, I just made sure that I added 2 wood beads in between each letter. And you can see here that these wood beads are giving me trouble because the opening wasn't quite big enough, but I was able to make it work using my pokey tool. After all my birds and my beads were strung onto my jute cord, I needed to make a tassel for at the bottom. I'm just using a square piece of wood here, and I have my jute twine. I wrapped it around about 20 or 25 times until I thought the tassel looked thick enough. And then I was able to just cut all of the jute cord pieces right through the center of the wood plank there. Now, because I strung everything onto a piece of jute cord that was folded in half, I'm able to tie my tassel right onto the bottom of my hanger. So I have my 2 pieces of jute cord that came out through my 2 bottom beads. I laid my strings on top of it, and then I just tied it in a double knot. About an inch down from the top of my tassel, I took another piece of jute cord, I tied it around, and then I wrapped the tails of that jute cord around the rest of the tassel, and I just used a little bit of hot glue to hold everything in place. I also want to mention too, if you want to make this a really quick craft, you could use the chalkboard side of these little birds and just get maybe white stickers or a brighter color sticker, and you wouldn't have to mess around with painting or staining everything, and this craft would come together in no time at all. I'm really glad the Dollar Tree started carrying these pom-pom makers. You can get a pack of 2 to make 2 smaller pom-poms, or you can get a single one in a pack that makes a larger pom-pom. I'm going to be using the larger one for this wreath, and I know the Dollar Tree does carry yarn from time to time also, but I picked my yarn up from Michael's and Walmart, and you can see here I have pink and white. I also grabbed one of these bunny ear headbands from the Dollar Tree. I just needed the ears from that. And I do have one of these wooden rings from the Dollar Tree. If you can't find one of these at your store, don't worry, you can make the base out of cardboard instead. If you've never used one of these pom-pom makers before, it's pretty simple. You can see here that both of the sides flap out, and it is 2 sections. It's connected in the center by a pin. What you want to do is open up one side of the pom-pom maker, and starting towards the center, just take whatever yarn color you're using and just start wrapping it from the center towards the outside. You can go back and forth and wrap it as many times as you want until you have it nice and full on one side. As you're wrapping back and forth to fill in all the spaces, once you have it nice and full, just make sure that you end towards the outside of the pom-pom maker. So keep the string on that end and then just close that flap over, and then that leaves your string in a good position to start on the next side. So go right from the side, you don't have to cut it off or anything, and just repeat the same process, working from the outside to the inside and back and forth until you have the second side as full as you like it. I wanted my pom-poms to be pretty thick and fluffy, so I made sure that I added quite a few layers of yarn to the pom-pom maker as I was wrapping back and forth. And I also wanted to share with you that if you don't feel like making all of these pom-poms, they do sell craft kits at the Dollar Tree that contain pom-poms. They looked a little thin to me, but I think you could make it work for this wreath also. And just like on the first side, when you're done wrapping the second side, you want to make sure that your ending piece is on the outside of the pom-pom maker. And again, you can clip it off after you've closed the flap. I think it just makes it a little bit easier. So you can see both sides of our pom-pom maker are nice and full with yarn now. And here's where you need a pretty sharp pair of scissors. There's a slight channel that runs through the center of the pom-pom maker, and you want to be able to slide your scissor blade into that channel so that you can start cutting all of the yarn that you wrapped away from the center of the pom-pom maker. Just make sure you have a little bit of a grip on the maker
maker itself so that the sides don't flip open as you're cutting. But you can see, because there is that channel through the center, it makes it nice and easy to cut through all of the yarn. And then you just want to repeat that on the second side also. Just slide your scissor blade into the center of that channel and then just start snipping away. If you have a lot of yarn on your pom-pom like I do, you can cut it in layers until you get down towards the center of the channel. Now, once you have all of the yarn cut away from the center, you just need to take another piece of the same color yarn and make sure it's long enough that whatever you're going to tie this onto, you have some extra length there, that you have some tails that you'll be able to tie it on. So now you can see here, you just need to slip that yarn right through that center channel. It'll go through both sides of the pom-pom maker. And once you have all of that string lined up through that center channel, you just want to knot it a few times. I usually just gave mine 2 ties. That was enough to hold everything together. Pull it fairly tight so that you can cinch all of those pieces of yarn that are already attached to the pom-pom maker together, and it'll create a nice fluffy pom-pom. Once you have both knots in place on your pom-pom maker, the last thing you need to do is open up both of those arms again, fold them out to the outside, and then, like I mentioned earlier, there is a pin on the inside of the pom-pom maker that's holding the 2 sides together. So you just want to gently pull that apart and your pom-pom will pop right out of the center. You might have a few extra long pieces here and there, and that's okay. Just take your scissors and give it a little bit of a trim so that all of the edges of your pom-pom are nice and even. And then, like I said, because we left that string nice and long, now we have a nice long set of tails that we'll be able to tie this pom-pom onto our wreath. After I had several pom-poms made, I started tying them onto my wreath form. Now you can choose to do this however you'd like. You can do all one color. I'm using 2 colors here, but you can use as many colors as you'd like. And you can do it in any pattern that you'd like to. I decided to go with 2 of each color around my wreath. So you can see here, I tied on 2 of the white ones to start. Once I had them tied on, then I went through and I had just added a little dot of hot glue to the underside of my pom-pom just to make sure that it wouldn't slide around on my wreath form. And like I mentioned before, if you don't have one of these wooden wreath forms, you could easily just make a ring out of cardboard. I would probably just cut 2 rings of the same size though and glue those 2 rings together just to make it a bit more sturdy. So once I had my 2 white pom-poms on, then I just repeated the same thing with 2 of the pink pom-poms, and I went the whole way around the outside of the wreath form. And when I got to the end, I did have to add a 3rd white pom-pom to the 2 that I started with, but that was okay because I just used that as the top of my wreath. And if you're curious, I did need 19 pom-poms altogether to fill up my wreath. Now for the bunny headband, the bunny ears have a piece of plastic running up through them that's connected to the headband, but it's pretty easy to snap off. So I just started by cutting the fur away first, and then I bent the bunny ear back and forth until it broke that piece of plastic. I'm going to leave that plastic in there though, just to make the ear stand up a bit better. So once I had the bunny ear taken off of the headband, I just used a little bit of hot glue to cinch the bottom together so that that plastic piece wouldn't fall apart. And then you can see here with the second ear, it was actually easier to break the plastic piece first. And then I was able to go back through, cut the ear off, and then use hot glue again to seal the end shut. I thought I would be able to just hot glue the bunny ears right to the top of my wreath, but it felt a little shaky to me, like it wasn't quite sturdy enough. So I did add hot glue right to the top of the wreath, and you can see I put the bunny ear right on top of it, but because it still felt loose to me, I flipped it over on the back, and then I just used a piece of a craft stick and I use that as a bridge between the backside of the bunny ear and the backside of the wreath, and it made that bunny ear stand up a little bit better, and it added a little more security to the backside of my wreath. Thanks so much for coming to hang out with me again today. I have some brand new ideas coming up later, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.